The Galactic Concord had spent millennia perfecting the art of first contact. Every new civilization encountered was greeted with the utmost decorum, a carefully curated message of peace and wisdom broadcast across the stars. Entire committees, formed over centuries, crafted these introductions with a level of detail that could put a quantum computer into sleep mode. And yet, none of their preparations accounted for Captain Cracker's. The transmission was meant for Earth's greatest thinkers, philosophers, and diplomats. Instead, it landed in the one place no one could have predicted, the dusty, outdated laptop of Gary Thompson, a retired Florida man whose primary life passions included microwaving questionable burritos, heckling reality TV contestants, and, most importantly, spoiling his beloved pet parrot, Captain Crackers. Gary, blissfully unaware of the universe-altering mistake occurring in his living room, was halfway through an episode of Real Housewives of Miami when a bright blue holographic sphere flickered onto his screen. A deep, otherworldly voice rumbled from his speakers. "Greetings, humans of Earth. We are the Galactic Concord, an alliance of enlightened civilizations. We extend our hand in peace and seek wisdom from your—" The voice was immediately drowned out by a shrill squawk. "Fight me, you space clowns!" Captain Crackers bellowed at full volume, flapping his wings and landing squarely on the keyboard. His beady eyes locked onto the glowing transmission as if he had just been challenged to a duel. There was a long, horrified silence on the other end of the transmission. The Galactic Concord, consisting of over 800 species, all tuned in for this historic moment, collectively paused. "Ah," said High Chancellor Xylo, an 8-limbed diplomat from the esteemed Zoltraxian race, his voice a mixture of confusion and distress. "It appears the humans have responded." The Concord's linguistic experts scrambled to analyze the strange outburst. Was this a coded message, a cultural idiom, a declaration of war? Squawk! "Your mama's so fat, she orbits her own planet." Captain Crackers screeched, ruffling his feathers in what he clearly believed was an intimidating display. A murmur of panic spread through the Concord's High Council chambers. It appears that their chosen representative is engaging in a dominance display, one of the lead Zoltraxian translators stammered, adjusting his glasses with trembling appendages. High Chancellor Xylo's bioluminescent skin flickered in a nervous pattern. See, and the insult regarding orbital mass? It is possible that this species assesses strength based on the density of their maternal progenitors, the translator whispered, horrified at the implications. At that moment, Gary returned from the kitchen, holding a bowl of something that could barely be classified as chili. He glanced at his laptop, saw the glowing blue alien faces staring at him, and assumed it was another one of those weird pop-up ads. "Man, I gotta stop clicking on those discount cruise links," he muttered, giving his laptop a casual whack. This did not, however, stop Captain Crackers. "Yo, you wanna go, bro?" the parrot hollered, hopping aggressively toward the screen. The AT Concord's ambassadors gasped. High Chancellor Xylo turned to his fellow council members, his voice grave. "It is as we feared. The humans are challenging us to ritual combat." The Supreme Archivist, a jelly-like being with 100 flickering eye stalks, trembled as he reviewed Earth's broadcast history. Their most revered cultural archives are filled with battle declarations such as this. "Observe." He gestured toward a series of intercepted human transmissions, playing a montage of people slamming folding chairs onto each other, figures in brightly colored spandex screaming, catchphrases, and heavily muscled warriors staring dramatically into cameras. The council recoiled. "My stars," whispered an elder representative. "They are warriors beyond comprehension." "We must proceed carefully," Xylo declared. "Any misstep could result in annihilation." Back on Earth, Captain Crackers had now fully committed to his aggressive performance. He flapped onto Gary's shoulder, fluffed himself up and squawked, "Squawk! Get wrecked, space nerds." The Galactic Concorde took precisely 5 seconds to reach a consensus. "We surrender," Xylo blurted in a panic. The room exploded into action. Generals prepared peace offerings. Diplomats began drafting an unconditional treaty. Xylo himself dictated a message directly to Earth, his voice trembling. "O Supreme Representative of Earth, we acknowledge your strength and wisdom. We, formally submit to your leadership. Please accept our most humble offerings." Gary, who was at this point focused entirely on whether he had left the oven on, frowned at the laptop. "Dang thing must be on the fritz again," he muttered. He closed the screen, causing the transmission to cut off. To the Concorde, this was confirmation. "Their Supreme Leader has ended communications," Xylo gasped. "It is finished." The council fell into stunned silence, only broken by the sound of the Supreme Archivist softly weeping. And so, in the span of 10 minutes, Captain Crackers had unknowingly secured humanity's place as the most feared force in the galaxy. Gary, blissfully unaware, turned back to his show. Captain Crackers, on the other hand, simply puffed out his chest, flapped his wings triumphantly, and muttered under his breath, "Squawk, bow before your overlord." The Galactic Concorde wasted no time in formulating their response. Every species in the Alliance had one immediate priority: survival. The humans, clearly ruled by an unpredictable and battle-hardened warlord in the form of a shrieking, aggressive bird, had left them no choice but to act swiftly. Emergency meetings were held across multiple solar systems. Armadas stood down, fearing provocation. The once unshakable High Chancellor Xylo found himself trembling at every unexpected sound, half expecting a booming parrot insult to materialize from the ether. And so, after much deliberation, they did what any rational civilization would do in such circumstances. They sent a delegation to Earth to formally apologize for ever having made contact. Meanwhile, in a small Florida living room that now held the galactic fate of multiple civilizations, Gary was attempting to get Captain Crackers off his laptop. "Dang bird, get off, I gotta check if that coupon for half-off wings at Benny's expired." He swatted at Captain Crackers, who expertly dodged, fluttering onto a nearby lamp and letting out an offended squawk. "Squawk! Better luck next time, loser!" Gary sighed. "Man, you've been watching too many reality shows." Unbeknownst to him, deep in orbit above Earth, a massive diplomatic vessel had just entered the planet's atmosphere. It was sleek, silver, and shaped like a giant teardrop, which was ironically appropriate given the sheer level of existential panic its crew was experiencing. Inside, High Chancellor Xylo took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. This was it, the moment that would determine the survival of the Galactic Concorde. He adjusted his ceremonial sash, a garment of great prestige that no longer seemed to hold much significance when he knew he was about to grovel at the feet of a neon-colored, foul-mouthed overlord. "Ambassador Veltox," Xylo said, turning toward a tall, elegant reptilian being who was gripping a large ceremonial scroll as though it might suddenly explode. "You will be the one to present the tribute. Make sure to use only the most formal and respectful language." Veltox nodded, stiffly. "Understood, Chancellor, and if the Supreme Representative chooses to respond with another display of verbal dominance." Xylo closed his eyes and exhaled through his gills. "Then we must simply endure." The ship descended, its landing gear delicately pressing into the backyard of an extremely confused neighbor who took one look at the glowing alien vessel and immediately went back inside to watch daytime soap operas, assuming it was some elaborate government drill he wanted no part of. The delegation, a group of high-ranking alien officials draped in shimmering robes, stepped cautiously onto Earth. Soil. They expected an official welcoming committee, perhaps military officers standing at attention. maybe a stadium full of chanting humans. Instead, they were greeted by a lawn flamingo with a bent neck and Gary standing on his porch in sweatpants, holding a lukewarm cup of gas station coffee. What in the... Gary squinted at the shimmering beings. Dang Jehovah's Witnesses getting real fancy these days. The aliens, already emotionally fragile from recent events, took this as some kind of advanced Earthling greeting ritual and immediately responded by bowing so low that one of them lost their balance and tipped face first into Gary's hibiscus bush. "Greetings, Supreme One," Xylo stammered. "We humbly offer our deepest apologies for disturbing your great and mighty dominion." Gary took a sip of coffee. "Huh?" Captain Crackers, who had been watching from the window, chose this exact moment to enter the scene. With a dramatic flutter of wings, he landed squarely on Gary's shoulder, puffed up to his full, ridiculous size. The aliens instantly tensed, standing so still they could have been statues. Captain Crackers surveyed the intergalactic delegation with the same casual arrogance of a king overlooking his court. Then, with a sharp intake of breath, he bellowed, "Squawk! Who invited you, space noobs?" The delegation flinched as if struck by an invisible force. Veltox, visibly trembling, stepped forward, carefully unrolling the ornate scroll. His voice quivered as he read, "O great and powerful supreme being, ruler of Earth, master of verbal combat—" "Hold up," Gary interrupted, holding up a hand. "Are you all talking to my bird?" A horrified silence fell over the delegation. Xylo's eye ridges furrowed. "You mean to say this is not your planetary leader?" Gary stared at them for a long moment. The smart thing to do would have been to clear up the misunderstanding, to explain that Captain Crackers was, in fact, an ordinary parrot with no real authority beyond ruining his sleep schedule with ungodly screeches at 3 a.m. But then again, Gary scratched his chin, glancing at the absurdly overdressed aliens, the trembling lizard-like one holding a scroll, and the general sense of fear radiating from them. He had lived a long life, a life filled with mistakes, misadventures, and extremely questionable decision-making. And right now, he was absolutely not about to pass up on the funniest thing that had ever happened to him. Yeah," Gary said, nodding solemnly. "Yep, that's him, Captain Crackers, Supreme Galactic Overlord." He gestured vaguely. "All bow before him or whatever." The delegation collapsed into frantic bows so low that one of them nearly fell over again. Captain Crackers fluffed himself up, clearly enjoying the attention. "Squawk! Worship me, minions!" Xylo, still kneeling, gestured for Veltox to continue. Reading the scroll. "In light of our previous transgressions, we, the Galactic Concord, present our most humble tribute." Two alien aides rushed forward, carrying an elaborate crystalline chest which, when opened, revealed a glowing orb of pure energy. Gary, who was really just hoping for some free snacks, frowned. "The heck is that?" "This," Xylo said with deep reverence, "is the celestial core of Sci-Fi, a relic of immeasurable power forged in the heart of a dying star." Gary took another sip of coffee. "Neat." Captain Crackers, meanwhile, took a long, thoughtful look at the glowing artifact. Then, after what seemed like deep contemplation, he gave his verdict. "Squawk! Lame! Bring me snacks! Peasants!" Xylo nearly choked on his own breath. "Yes, of course, Supreme One. We shall bring you the finest delicacies of the cosmos." The delegation scrambled, shouting orders into their wrist devices. Gary crossed his arms, watching this unfold. "Dang, I should have let you run my HOA meetings." Captain Crackers lifted a foot, ruffled his feathers, and let out a deep, self-satisfied squawk. Gary had no idea what had just happened, but one thing was clear: this was about to get way funnier. The Galactic Concord had prided itself on its long history of diplomacy. Countless civilizations had been welcomed into the fold with grace and poise. Even when dealing with warlike species, there had always been a careful, strategic approach. weeks, months, even years of negotiations to ensure peace. And yet, in less than 48 hours, everything had been thrown out the nearest airlock by a bird that had just demanded snacks. The diplomatic delegation, still kneeling before Captain Crackers, was in full panic mode. Their universal translators were still struggling to decipher the deeper meaning behind his latest proclamation: "Squawk, bow before me, or face the wrath of 1,000 Nakos." The linguists stationed aboard the Concorde's orbital vessel were working overtime to analyze the threat. "Could nachos be a type of advanced Earthling weapon?" one scholar suggested, wiping sweat from his brow. 1,000 of them? Another whispered in horror. "What scale of destruction are we even dealing with?" "I have reviewed ancient Earth transmissions," a third linguist chimed in, displaying blurry images of tortilla chips covered in molten cheese. "I believe it is an offering, one that signifies either deep respect or an impending act of war." The council chambers erupted into panicked debate. Meanwhile, on the surface of Earth, Gary was watching this whole debacle unfold while eating a stale bagel. He had barely gotten out of his pajamas, and now he was somehow in charge of an intergalactic incident. The funniest part? He had no reason to stop it. Captain Crackers, now perched on a decorative garden gnome, surveyed the trembling aliens before him, seemingly deep in thought. Gary had never seen the bird look this smug. Finally, the silence was broken when Xylo spoke. "Oh, Supreme One," he said, voice wavering, "we will prepare the great galactic snack tribute immediately. But in the meantime—" He hesitated, clearly terrified of upsetting his new cosmic overlord. "There is another urgent matter." Gary raised an eyebrow. "Yeah? What now?" Xylo hesitated before gesturing to Veltox, who stepped forward, looking as though he'd rather be anywhere else in the universe. "Supreme One," Veltox said, gripping his ceremonial scroll as though it might explode. "Your dominance over the Galactic Concorde is, of course, absolute. However, there are those among the Alliance who do not yet understand the full breadth of your power." Captain Crackers tilted his head. "Squawk! You doubt me, fools!" Veltox went deathly pale. No, never! But the Galactic Senate is struggling to grasp the finer details of our encounter. They wish to meet you in person." Gary choked on his bagel. "Oh, heck no," he muttered. "There is no way," but before he could finish, Xylo, Veltox, and the rest of the delegation had already fallen into another round of deep bows. "It is the only way, Supreme One," Xylo begged. "Please, we will transport you to the Concords." "Grand Assembly at once," Gary scratched his head. "Now hold on." Captain Crackers, however, was already flapping his wings excitedly. "Squawk! Road trip, baby!" The delegation scrambled to their feet, rushing to make the arrangements before their galactic overlord could change his mind. Gary stared blankly at his bird. "Well, buddy," he sighed, finishing his coffee in one gulp, "I guess we're going to space." A mere 6 hours later, Gary found himself sitting inside the most luxurious spaceship he had ever seen in his life. Not that he had a lot to compare it to. The walls were a sleek, shimmering blue, embedded with strange alien symbols. The floor was somehow soft, despite looking like polished metal, and the seating arrangement immaculate. It was also completely wasted on him. Gary had brought a gas station burrito aboard. He had not asked if it was allowed. He had not cared. Across from him, Xylo sat stiffly, watching him take another bite of the suspiciously microwaved food. The High Chancellor had many questions about human sustenance, but his fear of causing offense overruled his curiosity. Captain Crackers, meanwhile, was absolutely thriving. The parrot had his own seat, a throne-like contraption that Xylo had hastily assembled from ceremonial cushions and an unused war banner. He sat atop it like a king, eyes gleaming as he overlooked. His subjects. The only problem? He had gotten bored, and when Captain Crackers got bored, everyone suffered. "Squawk! You call this a spaceship?" he suddenly shrieked, startling a nearby pilot so badly that they nearly crashed into the moon. Xylo jolted upright. Do you wish for modifications, Supreme One? We can install weaponry, thrusters, perhaps even an entertainment chamber." "Squawk! Lame!" Crackers flapped his wings in protest. "I want to drive!" Xylo turned an unnatural shade of blue. Gary finally stepped in. "Yeah, I don't think letting him fly the ship is a good... It is his will," Xylo interrupted before signaling frantically to the pilots. The main pilot, a four-armed being covered in shimmering exoskeleton, turned in horror. You want me to hand over controls?" "The Supreme One has spoken," Xylo barked clearly, having given up entirely on logical decision-making. Gary, to his credit, did try to protest. He really did. But it was already too late, because 5 minutes later, Captain Crackers was sitting at the ship's main controls, staring at the glowing interface before him like a maniacal child discovering the buttons on an elevator. "Oh, this is so gonna get us killed," Gary muttered, rubbing his temples. "Squawk! Light speed, baby!" Crackers bellowed. Before anyone could stop him, he slammed his beak into the nearest glowing button. The ship lurched. Xylo screamed. Veltok screamed. The pilot screamed. Gary stuffed the last of his burrito into his mouth before grabbing onto his seat for dear life. And Captain Crackers was having the time of his life. The ship rocketed forward, soaring past planets, dodging asteroids with absurd luck, and executing a series of maneuvers that no sane pilot would ever attempt. The Concorde's finest diplomats were clinging to their seats, their eyes wide with existential terror, and in the middle of it all, Captain Crackers cackled. "Squawk!" Drifting through space like a boss. By the time the ship finally arrived, at the Concorde's grand assembly, it was a miracle that everyone was still alive. The pilots collapsed onto the floor in relief. Veltox was visibly shaking. Xylo, somehow, had developed wrinkles that were not there before. Gary, unfazed, adjusted. "His sweatpants, whelp," he sighed, stretching. "That was something." Captain Crackers hopped onto his shoulder, puffing out his chest proudly. "Squawk! Space noobs can't handle the heat." As the ship's doors opened to reveal the Galactic Senate waiting below, Gary glanced at the sea of high-ranking alien officials, all waiting expectantly for their terrifying supreme overlord. Gary exhaled. "All right, Crackers," he muttered. "Time to make some real bad decisions." The Galactic Senate was the most powerful governing body in the universe, a majestic structure carved into the very fabric of a drifting planet that orbited a pulsar. It was where civilizations gathered to settle disputes, form alliances, and shape the destiny of the cosmos. Today, however, it was bracing for what would undoubtedly be its most chaotic session in recorded history. The doors to the Senate Hall slid open, revealing a room filled with over 1,000 delegates from countless species, their various tentacles, eye stalks, and exoskeletons trembling in anxious anticipation. Rows of towering seats stretched to the domed ceiling, illuminated by a soft, pulsating glow. The air crackled with barely restrained fear. Then, stepping onto the grand platform, meant only for the most esteemed of galactic leaders, came the most feared entity in the known universe. A parrot. Captain Crackers strutted forward, feathers puffed, wings slightly raised, as if he had personally conquered every solar system represented here. His sharp, beady eyes scanned the vast chamber, his expression one of barely contained arrogance. Behind him, Gary casually shuffled into view, hands in his pockets, still munching on the remnants of a gas station burrito. High Chancellor Xylo, however, entered as a shaking mess, his once regal posture reduced to that of a terrified intern, hoping he wouldn't get fired on his first day. A solemn silence gripped the assembly as the supreme speaker, an ancient being whose form was more mist than flesh, slowly rose from the center podium. "Honored representatives of the Galactic Concord," the speaker intoned, in a voice that echoed across dimensions. "We gather here in an emergency session to bear witness to the arrival of the supreme voice of Earth, the one known as Captain Crackers." The entire chamber collectively flinched. Captain Crackers tilted his head dramatically. The silence stretched. Then, without warning, he let out an ear-splitting, soul-shaking screech. "Squawk! You call this a meeting? Looks like a convention for losers!" Several delegates recoiled so violently that at least 3 of them fainted on the spot. Others gasped, their translators scrambling to process what had just been declared. A deep, horrified murmur rippled through the room. The Supreme Speaker hesitated. "We wish to understand, O Supreme One," they said cautiously. "Is this a formal challenge?" A nervous Scarathian delegate whose species communicated through bioluminescent pulses flashed a panicked sequence of lights. "He's about to declare war," it whispered to its neighbor. Xylo, who had long since abandoned his will to resist this absurdity, simply nodded in resignation. "Yes," he confirmed gravely, "it is a challenge." More murmurs. A council member from the Amphorax race, a species of towering insectoids known for their military strategy, clicked its mandibles anxiously. "If we refuse this challenge," it said in a hushed tone, "we risk insulting him further. We may be erased from history." The speaker took a deep, unnecessary breath, then turned back toward Captain Crackers. "Very well, Supreme One," they said, voice shaking slightly. "We accept. How shall we proceed?" The room tensed. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the declaration of galactic conquest, the terms of their impending surrender, the demands for absolute servitude. Instead, Captain Crackers fluffed his feathers, took a deep breath and screamed, "Squawk! 1v1 me, bro. Chaos." Half the chamber lost their minds, scrambling to understand what they were now required to do. Was this a sacred duel, a test of strength, a declaration of interstellar combat? Xylo, now so far beyond the realm of rationality that he might as well have been floating through space without a suit, turned to Gary for guidance. "What does this mean?" he whispered, barely holding himself together. Gary, still chewing, considered the question. He thought about clarifying that it was just something Crackers picked up from video games. He considered explaining that it was a meaningless challenge meant to provoke internet arguments. But then he thought what would be the funniest possible outcome. And so, with a completely straight face, he said, "Means he wants to fight the strongest warrior in the galaxy." Xylo looked like he was about to pass out. The Supreme Speaker turned back to the chamber. "Then we must select a champion," they declared. Immediately, representatives began shouting over each other. "We must not offend him. The strongest warrior must fight, but what if the Supreme One is too powerful? We could lose our champion instantly. Perhaps we should forfeit. No, we must honor the challenge." The debate raged for a full 5 minutes before at last the decision was made. From the far end of the chamber, a monstrous figure stepped forward. Nearly 8 feet tall, with rippling muscles, 6 arms, and an expression of stone-cold murder, stood the reigning intergalactic combat champion, Thraxer the Undefeated. Thraxer had never lost a duel. His fists were said to shatter moons. His glare alone had reportedly caused weaker beings to implode. He was a walking, breathing war machine. He approached the center of the chamber, cracking his knuckles. "I accept," he rumbled, voice like a distant avalanche. The room fell into utter silence. Captain Crackers tilted his head, considering the absolute unit of destruction before him. Then, very slowly, he flapped forward. Thraxor planted his feet, bracing for whatever unspeakable combat technique this eldritch bird might unleash. Captain Crackers took a deep breath. Then, with the speed of a comet, he latched onto Thrax's face and bit him directly on the nose. "Squawk! Get wrecked, space nerd!" Thraxor, the most powerful warrior in the known universe, let out an unholy shriek. Arms flailing wildly, he spun, crashed into a pillar, tripped over his own feet, and collapsed face first onto the chamber floor. The room went dead silent. The Galactic Senate, composed of some of the most powerful, intelligent, and sophisticated beings in the universe, collectively lost their minds. "The Supreme One has defeated Thraxor," someone shrieked, "with a single move." Another cried, "He is unstoppable." The Supreme Speaker dropped their staff in shock. The Senate recognizes the total victory of Supreme Leader Captain Crackers. Xylo, feeling the last remnants of his sanity slip away, simply nodded. Of course, as expected. Captain Crackers released Thrax's nose, fluttered back onto Gary's shoulder, and ruffled his feathers proudly. Gary, who was now officially the handler of the most feared being in the galaxy, casually patted his bird's head. "Welp," he said, cracking a grin. "Guess we run the place now." The chamber erupted into cheers, praise, and newly proposed laws that would cement Earth's dominance for generations to come. Somewhere, in the far reaches of space, a new legend was born, a legend of a warrior. Leader a parrot, and the galaxy would never be the same again.